everybody, and welcome to today's video. We're going to kick this week's coverage off with a video looking at a game that I have already reviewed. You can go head over to digitallydownloaded.net to check out the review right now. It came out last week. I wanted to have my review up as soon as possible, so there it is. I think it is an excellent game, well worth playing. I do hope that a lot of people discover it, even though it did come out in the middle of a very busy period and is a very niche game within a niche genre. But nonetheless, again, I think it is a very good game. Do check it out. And the reason I want to do this video is because it does point to a topic of discussion that I would like to see happen more often in video games. I think it is important for games as they develop as an art form to really take what this game represents and run with it. And that's what this video is going to be about today. So you'll get to see some of the game in action, but we're talking about it in a more general sense, I guess. The game's name is Xuan-Yuan VII, and I do hope I pronounced that right. I gave it my best shot. My Chinese pronunciation is nowhere near adequate, and I do apologize if I got it wrong. I'm going to try and limit how often I say the name of the game in this video because I don't want to embarrass myself any more than I just did. But anyway, Xuan-Yuan VII, and it is a game from a Taiwanese developer, and it is, as the number 7 suggests, it is a game that has been going for quite some time in Taiwan and China. It is massively popular over there. They've created a TV series of it. It is basically to the Chinese what you would say Final Fantasy is to us in the West and in Japan. It is kind of that size and profile. We haven't had too many of them released in English though. The last one was, number 6 was, it was released as Sword and Fairy in the West, and then they've kept the Chinese name for this latest release, both of which were released in the West by East Asia Soft. And this latest one, they actually went through a full review of the localization, which was very beneficial to it as well. One of the criticisms of Sword and Fairy 6 when it released, even though it was a global release, the localization was not very good. For this one, they've done a really good job in going back and editing it, and it just plays beautifully now. It really does feel like a mid-tier RPG, but pushing towards the upper echelons thanks to its gorgeous visuals, with a decent, solid script and localization effort behind it, which is something we haven't had too much of with relationship to Taiwanese and Chinese games that have been released in the West. If you remember Final Fantasy or Japanese games a couple of decades ago when the Super Nintendo and Nintendo were kind of, and the Mega Drive and whatever, when those retro consoles were the ones that people were playing, a lot of Japanese games had very poor quality translations, which almost became infamous and beloved for that. But obviously as the years went on, more translators got involved in the game, and the quality of translation from Japanese into English for video games improved. The Chinese and Taiwanese industries are a little bit further behind because it's been relatively recently that they've started to engage with the rest of the world in terms of bringing their games to us, and as a result the localization efforts for a lot of these games needs to catch up. So in a lot of ways East Asia Soft is kind of pioneering something special, I would like to hope, in bringing a full quality translation for one of these major games to the West. That's not what we're here to talk about though. That was kind of just my overview of the game. It is great. Just give it a go. Read my review as well, but definitely give it a go. The point of this video, and what I want to talk about in the context of this video though, is the idea of world games and the idea of the video game industry developing a foreign games kind of category that we can identify in the same way that film and literature and all the other art forms have, because to date, video games have been a lot more kind of homogenized, and I think that is to the detriment of video games as an art form. But this opportunity that independent developers have, and this appetite for different games that we're starting to see in the indie through mid-tier space, really has given us this opportunity to develop a foreign world, whatever you want to call it, but world games category, which is very exciting in terms of its potential. So if we talk about storytelling games, and in particular the RPG and JRPG, because that's the genre we're kind of looking at here in the screen as we talk, there are two real categories where the vast majority of the games come from in terms of their storytelling tradition. The first is the Western RPG, which acts as a kind of homogenized mess of Western cultures without any identifiable single country or culture being represented. But when we look at the game, we recognize it as this Western cultural product. The other one is, of course, the Japanese RPG, which typically exhibits Japanese storytelling traditions, and in particular the anime tradition. That's the most common use of the Japanese storytelling tradition in RPGs, is the kind of the anime tradition. So that's really kind of it, and that's been the case for much of the existence of the RPG and JRPG genre, going right back to Wizardry and Rogue and all the rest of it. They really belonged either to the homogenized West or Japan. And that's not to criticize either of those. I love all of those games, and I've played the genre since I've been around, so plenty of decades now. But when you look at storytelling traditions in other art forms, then it does become a lot more specific to culture. So, for example, in cinema, you've got European cinema, and French cinema is certainly different to UK cinema, which is different to the work of Lars von Trier, and the Russian cinema is another thing entirely. Then you look at Asian cinema, there's Japanese cinema traditions and movements and Japanese New Wave and all those things that are kind of exclusive to the Japanese cinema tradition. There's Chinese cinema. There's, of course, Disney and Hollywood, which represents American culture as it is presented to the rest of the world through cinema. And the same applies to literature, to music. There are instruments that are exclusive, well, not exclusive, but there are instruments that are traditional to these cultures. And in the use of those instruments, we get a sense of that particular culture. That's why we have what is called a world music category. And there is a certain level of imperialism in that, I guess, in that it kind of has the default as the Western and generally American traditions, and then the rest of the world is kind of foreign to that, which is a little bit strange, since to me here as an Australian, America is technically foreign to me. So anyway, but that's another topic for another day. The point is that we do have these world music traditions. We have these world movie, foreign movie categories in award ceremonies and all that stuff. We have literature that comes from various cultures around the world and is identifiable as from that country. In fact, countries tend to take a lot of pride in the literature that they have produced. So then when we look at all of that and we take it into context, the question then becomes, why do we not do the same thing with video games? And I'll give you an example that's just come up. Ace Team, working out of South America, has just released a new game in the Eternal Cylinder. And we don't really talk about Ace Team's games as Latin American game development. They have been around for a long time, they've released a lot of games, and they certainly have a very distinct style that you could say is Ace Team's. But we're not really so interested in talking about the implications of that style for the Latin American culture, what it represents, and how Ace Team arrived at the game style that they have by way of their culture. Those are things that we talk about with relationship to film, literature, music, and all the rest of the arts, but not video games. I think part of it has to do with the tradition that it was very hard to make video games outside of the two markets that we kind of see as dominating the video game space. So, for example, Western developers had all the money and they were the ones making all the games, or if they weren't, then the Japanese ones, the developers, were making the rest of them. So it was really only two broad markets, but two markets where the video games were being produced out of. That's, of course, changing now because game development is becoming a lot more accessible to a lot more people, and I would think that we will start to talk more and more about these things, especially out of Asia, now that Taiwan is really producing some excellent quality games, now that Korean development is coming along really well, now that China is getting involved in video games. And we're starting to see a lot of really interesting indie stuff come out of places like the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand. So there is certainly a growing game development industry across all of Asia, and through that we're going to start seeing more stories that are culturally appropriate, or not appropriate, culturally reflective, and that's certainly a good thing, and hopefully that starts to generate these conversations about a world games sector. And perhaps there is another reason, that simply video games lend themselves towards being homogenized, because video games are the project of a lot of people, and a lot of people have creative input into those games. What we do have is a lot of homogenization that happens within the game development process that results in a certain flattening of the creative curve when it comes to games. That's not to say games can't be creative or interesting or different, but it's really rare that you get a person like a Yoko Taro who's able to really stamp his own creative vision on every one of his projects. We know that Yoko Taro's games are distinctly Japanese because Yoko Taro, as a Japanese game developer, is able to really just do what he wants to do. That doesn't happen that often in video games, and for another example, for the Ace Team, we don't really know the name of the creator of the Ace Team games. It's just an Ace Team project. And perhaps that does affect our perception of whether these games are kind of cultural artifacts, because companies are a different kind of beast to individual artists, and companies are kind of a universal thing across the entire world. The differences in how companies operate isn't nearly as great as the differences in the which kind of people think. So perhaps that is part of it as well. I don't know, I'm just throwing ideas around here. I would certainly love to hear your own thoughts about why we have not really developed a world games sector as such just yet, or why we don't talk about video games in terms of their cultural qualities nearly as much as we might do with film or literature or music. I'm certainly interested to hear your thoughts. Anyhow, that's enough for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed the footage of the game. I think it's an excellent game. I'm not going to pronounce it again because, once again, I don't want to embarrass myself, but I hope you've enjoyed the footage. Please do read my review on digitally-downloaded.net and let me know your thoughts if you have played it. Otherwise, if you do enjoy my videos, please do mash that like and subscribe button. That way you will get a notification whenever I upload a new one. And if you do want to support the work that we're doing here at digitally-downloaded.net, you can jump on over to our Patreon and support us for as little as $1 a month, or more if you're feeling generous. And by supporting us, you will directly, firstly, support us in growing what we're doing with the channel and with the website and all the rest of it. But you'll also get a 48-page magazine each month, which is pretty decent quality, I like to think. And it gives you a bit more of a cultural kind of insight into Japan and stuff. We talk about literature, music and film and all the other kind of qualities about Japan rather than just games. We do talk about games a lot too, of course, but it's more about the overall culture and nation and how we arrive at those games that we just love as distinctly Japanese works. Alright, thanks very much. As always, we will see you at the next video.